Writing and man's exploitation by man. The bricoler may not ever complete his purpose, but he always puts something of himself into it. The savage mind, perhaps his system is false, but developing it, he has painted himself truly. J.J. Rousseau. Dialogues. Let us finally open a writing lesson. If I give so much attention to the chapter, it is not in order to take unfair advantage of a travel journal, something that could be considered the least scientific expression of a thought. On the one hand, all the themes of the systematic theory of writing presented for the first time in Tries Tropiques may be found in other writings. 116 in another form and more or less dispersed. On the other hand, the theoretical content is itself expounded at length in this work, at greater length than anywhere else, by way of comment on an extraordinary incident. This incident is also reported in the same terms at the beginning of the dissertation on the Nambicura, 7 years earlier than Tries Tropiques. Finally, it is only in Tries Tropiques that the system is articulated in the most rigorous and complete way. The indispensable premises one, namely the nature of the organism submitted to the aggression of writing one, are nowhere more explicit. That is why I have followed the description of the innocence of the Nambicura at length. Only an innocent community, and a community of reduced dimensions, a Rousseauist theme that will soon become clearer, only a micro-society of nonviolence and freedom, all the members of which can by rights remain within range of an immediate and transparent, a crystalline address, fully self-present in its living speech. Only such a community can suffer one as the surprise of an aggression coming from without, the insinuation of writing, the infiltration of its ruse and of its perfidy. Only such a community can import from abroad the exploitation of man by man. The lesson is therefore complete. In subsequent texts, the theoretical conclusions of the incident will be presented without the concrete premises, original innocence will be implied but not expounded. In the previous text, the dissertation on the Nambicura, the incident is reported but it does not lead, as in Tries Tropiques, to a long meditation on the historical meaning, origin, and function of the written. On the other hand, I shall draw from the dissertation information that will be valuable as annotations to Tries Tropiques. Writing, the exploitation of man by man. I do not impose these words upon Levi Strauss. Let us recall the conversations by way of precaution. Writing itself, in that first instance, seemed to be associated in any permanent way only with societies which were based on the exploitation of man by man, p. 36, po. 30. In Tries Tropiques, Levi Strauss is aware of proposing a Marxist theory of writing. He says it in a letter of 1955, the year the book appeared, to the Nouvelle Critique. See criticized by M. Rodinson in the name of Marxism. He complains, if he M. Rodinson had read my book, instead of confining himself to the extracts published a few months ago, he would have discovered in addition to a Marxist hypothesis on the origins of writing 2 studies dedicated to Brazilian tribes, the Cativio and the Borora, which are efforts to interpret native superstructures based upon dialectical materialism. The novelty of this approach in the Western anthropological literature perhaps deserves more attention and sympathy. Our question is therefore no longer only how to reconcile Rousseau and Marx, but also, is it sufficient to speak of superstructure and to denounce in an hypothesis an exploitation of man by man in order to confer a Marxian pertinence upon this hypothesis? A question that has meaning only through implying an original rigor in Marxist criticism and distinguish it from all other criticism of suffering, of violence, of exploitation, etc., for example, from Buddhist criticism. Our question has clearly no meaning at the point where one can say between Marxist criticism and Buddhist criticism there is neither opposition nor contradiction. 18 Another precaution is necessary before the lesson. I have earlier emphasized the ambiguity of the ideology which governs the Saussurian exclusion of writing, a profound ethnocentrism privileging the model of phonetic writing, a model that makes the exclusion of the graphy easier and more legitimate. It is, however, an ethnocentrism thinking itself as anti-ethnocentrism, an ethnocentrism in the consciousness of a liberating progressivism. By radically separating language from writing, by placing the latter below and outside, believing at least that it is possible to do so, by giving oneself the illusion of liberating linguistics from all involvement with written evidence, one thinks in fact to restore the status of authentic language, human and fully signifying language, to all languages practiced by peoples whom one nevertheless continues to describe as without writing. It is not fortuitous that the same ambiguity affects Levi Strauss's intentions. On the one hand, the colloquial difference between language and writing, the rigorous exteriority of one with respect to the other, is admitted. This permits the distinction between peoples using writing and peoples without writing. Levi Strauss is never suspicious of the value of such a distinction. This above all allows him to consider the passage from speech to writing as a leap, as the instantaneous crossing of a line of discontinuity, passage from a fully oral language, pure of all writing pure, innocent to a language appending to itself its graphic representation as an accessory signifier of a new type, opening a technique of oppression. Levi Strauss needed this epigenetist concept of writing in order that the theme of evil and of exploitation suddenly coming about with the graphic could indeed be the theme of a surprise and an accident affecting the purity of an innocent language from without. Affecting it as if by chance. 19 At any rate the epigenetist thesis repeats, in connection with writing this time, an affirmation that we could have encountered 5 years previously in the introduction al over de Marcel Mauss, p. 47, language could only have been born suddenly. We might well find numerous questions to raise about this paragraph, which ties sense to signification and more narrowly to linguistic signification in the spoken language. Let us simply read these few lines. The violence of the letter 121 whatever might have been the moment and the circumstances of its appearance on the scale of animal life, language could only have been born suddenly. Things could not have begun to signify progressively. Following a transformation whose study does not belong to the social sciences, but to biology and psychology, a passage was effected from a stage where nothing had sense to another where everything did. That biology and psychology could account for this rupture would seem to us more than problematic. There follows a fertile distinction between signifying discourse and knowing discourse, which, some 50 years previously, a philosopher of consciousness, more neglected than others, had articulated rigorously in logical investigations. This epigenetism is, nevertheless, not the most Rousseauist aspect of a thought which so often gives as its authority the essay on the origin of languages and the second discourse where however it is also a question of LTTHE infinite space of time that the first invention of languages must have cost po. 189. The traditional and fundamental ethnocentrism which, inspired by the model of phonetic writing, separates writing from speech with an axe, is thus handled and thought of as anti-ethnocentrism. It supports an ethico-political accusation, man's exploitation by man is the fact of writing cultures of the Western type. Communities of innocent and unoppressive speech are free from this accusation. On the other hand it is the other side of the same gesture if Levi Strauss constantly recognizes the pertinence of the division between peoples with and peoples without writing, this division is effaced by him from the moment that one might ethnocentrically wish to make it play a role in the reflection on history and on the respective value of cultures. The difference between peoples with and peoples without writing is accepted, but writing as the criterion of historicity or cultural value is not taken into account. Ethnocentrism will apparently be avoided at the very moment when it will have already profoundly operated, silently imposing its standard concepts of speech and writing. This was exactly the pattern of the Saussurian gesture. In other words, all the liberating criticisms and legitimate denunciations with which Levi Strauss has harried the presupposed distinctions between historical societies and societies without history, remain dependent on the concept of writing I problematize here. What is the writing lesson? Lesson in a double sense. The title effectively preserves both senses. /I writing lesson, since it is a question of the learning of writing. The Nambikora chief learns writing from the anthropologist, at first without comprehension. He mimics writing before he understands its function as language, or rather he understands its profoundly enslaving function before understanding its function, here accessory, of communication, signification, of the tradition of a signified. The writing lesson is also a lesson learned from writing, instruction that the anthropologist believes he can induce from the incident in the course of a long meditation, when, fighting against insomnia, he reflects on the origin, function, and meaning of writing. Having taught the gesture of writing to a Nambikora chief who learned without comprehension, the anthropologist understands what he has taught and induces the lesson of writing. Thus, 2 moments, A. The empirical relation of a perception, the scene of the extraordinary incident. B. After the vicissitudes of the day, sleepless in the watches of the night, a historico-philosophical reflection on the scene of writing and the profound meaning of the incident, of the closed history of writing. A. The extraordinary incident. From the very first lines, the decor reminds us of that anthropological violence of which I spoke above. The 2 parts are well engaged here, and that restores the true meaning of the remarks on a great sweetness of nature, an animal satisfaction as ingenuous as it is charming, the profound nonchalance, the most moving and authentic manifestations of human tenderness. For example, their more than dubious welcome combined with their leader's extreme nervousness seemed to suggest that he had forced their hand, somewhat, in the whole matter. Neither we nor the Indians felt at all at our ease. The night promised to be cold, and, as there were no trees, we had to lie, like the Nambikora, on the bare ground. No one slept. We kept, all night long, a polite watch upon one another. It would have been rash to prolong the adventure, and I suggested to the leader that we should get down to our exchanges without further delay. It was then that there occurred an extraordinary incident which forces me to go back a little in time. That the Nambikora could not write goes without saying. But they were also unable to draw, except for a few dots and zigzags on their calabashes. I distributed pencils and paper among them, nonetheless, as I had done with the Kadivio. At first they made no use of them. Then, one day, I saw that they were all busy drawing wavy horizontal lines on the paper. What were they trying to do? I could only conclude that they were writing, or, more exactly, they were trying to do as I did with my pencils. As I had never tried to amuse them with drawings, they could not conceive of any other use for this implement. With most of them, that was as far as they got, but their leader saw further into the problem. Doubtless he was the only one among them to have understood what writing was for PO 288. Let us mark a first pause here. Among many others, this fragment comes superimposed upon a passage from the thesis on the Nambikora. The violence of the letter incident was already related there, and it may be useful to refer to it. 3 specific points omitted from Trees Tropicase can be found in the thesis. They are not without interest. 1. This small group of Nambikora 2, and nevertheless uses a word to designate the act of writing, at least a word that may serve that end. There is no linguistic surprise in the face of the supposed eruption of a new power. This detail, omitted from Trees Tropicase, was indicated in the thesis. The Nambikora of group A do not know anything about design, if one accepts some geometric sketches on their calabashes. For many days, they did not know what to do with the paper and the pencils that we distributed to them. Some time later, we saw them very busily drawing wavy lines. In that they imitated the only use that they had seen us make of our notebooks, namely writing, but without understanding its meaning or its end. They called the act of writing ikari akijutu, namely, drawing lines. It is quite evident that a literal translation of the words that mean to write in the languages of peoples with writing would also reduce that word to a rather poor gestural signification. It is as if one said that such a language has no word designating writing, and that therefore those who practice it do not know how to write just because they use a word meaning to scratch, to engrave, to scribble, to scrape, to incise, to trace, to imprint, etc. As if to write in its metaphoric kernel meant something else. Is not ethnocentrism always betrayed by the haste with which it is satisfied by certain translations or certain domestic equivalents? To say that a people do not know how to write because one can translate the word which they use to designate the act of inscribing as drawing lines, is that not as if one should refuse them speech by translating the equivalent word by to cry, to sing, to sigh, indeed to stammer? By way of simple analogy with respect to the mechanisms of ethnocentric assimilation/exclusion, let us recall with Renan that, in the most ancient languages, the words used to designate foreign peoples are drawn from 2 sources, either words that signify to stammer, to mumble, or words that signify mute. 21 and ought one to conclude that the Chinese are a people without writing because the word when designates many things besides writing in the narrow sense. As in fact J. Jemmett notes, the word when signifies a conglomeration of marks, the simple symbol in writing. It applies to the veins in stones and wood, to constellations, represented by the strokes connecting the stars, to the tracks of birds and quadrupeds on the ground. Chinese tradition would have it that the observation of these tracks suggested the invention of writing, to tattoo, and even, for example, to the designs that decorate the turtle's shell. The turtle is wise, an ancient text says gifted with magico-religious powers for it carries designs on its back. The term when has designated, by extension, literature and social courtesy. Its antonyms are the words wu, warrior, military, and ji, brute matter not yet polished or ornamented. 2. In this operation, which consists of drawing lines and which is thus incorporated into the dialect of this subgroup, Levi Strauss finds an exclusively aesthetic signification. They called the act of writing ikari akijutu, namely drawing lines, which had an aesthetic interest for them. One wonders what the import of such a conclusion could be and what the specificity of the aesthetic category could signify here. Levi Strauss seems not only to presume that one can isolate aesthetic value, which is clearly most problematic, and in fact it is the anthropologists more than anyone else who have put us on guard against this abstraction, but also to suppose that in writing properly speaking, to which the Nambikora would not have access, the aesthetic quality is extrinsic. Let us merely mention this problem. Moreover, even if one did not wish to treat the meaning of such a conclusion with suspicion, one could still be troubled by the paths that lead to it. The anthropologist has arrived at this conclusion through a sentence noted in another subgroup, Kikagnarum phi \in translated by drawing lines, that's pretty. To conclude from this proposition thus translated and recorded within another group, by, that drawing lines held for group, al, an aesthetic interest, which implies only an aesthetic interest, is what poses problems of logic that once again we are content simply to mention. 3. When, in Trees Tropicase, Levi Strauss remarks that the Nambikora could not write, they were also unable to draw, except for a few dots and zigzags on their calabashes, because, helped by instruments furnished by them, they trace only wavy horizontal lines, and that with most of them, that was as far as they got. These notations are brief. Not only are they not to be found in the thesis, but, in fact, 80 pages further on, p123, the thesis presents the results at which certain Nambikora very quickly arrived and which Levi Strauss treats as a cultural innovation inspired by our own designs. It is not merely a question of representational designs, D figure 19, p123, showing a man or a monkey, but of diagrams describing, explaining, writing, a genealogy and a social structure. And that is a decisive phenomenon. It is now known, thanks to unquestionable and abundant information, that the birth of writing, in the colloquial sense, was nearly everywhere and most often linked to genealogical anxiety. The memory and oral tradition of generations, which sometimes goes back very far with people supposedly without writing, are often cited in this connection. Levi Strauss himself does it in the Conversations, p. 29, po. 26. I know, of course, that the societies we call primitive often have a quite staggering capacity for remembering, and we have been told about Polynesian the violence of the letter communities who can recite straight off family trees involving dozens of generations, but that kind of feat obviously has its limits. Now it is this limit which is crossed more or less everywhere when writing in the colloquial sense appears. Here its function is to conserve and give to a genealogical classification, with all that that might imply, a supplementary objectification of another order. So that a people who accede to the genealogical pattern accede also to writing in the colloquial sense, understand its function and go much farther than Treece Tropiques gives it to be understood, that was as far as they got. Here one passes from archie writing to writing in the colloquial sense. This passage, whose difficulty I do not wish to underestimate, is not a passage from speech to writing, it operates within writing in general. The genealogical relation and social classification are the stitched seam of archie writing, condition of the so-called oral language, and of writing in the colloquial sense. But their leader saw further into the problem. The dissertation tells us that this leader is remarkably intelligent, aware of his responsibilities, active, enterprising, and ingenious. He was a man of about 35, married to 3 women. His attitude to writing is most revealing. He immediately understood its role as sign, and the social superiority that it confers. Levi Strauss follows up with an account which is reproduced in nearly the same terms in Treece Tropiques. Doubtless he was the only one among them who understood what writing was for. So he asked me for one of my notepads, and thus we were similarly equipped when we were working together. He did not give me his answers in words, but traced a wavy line or two on the paper and gave it to me, as if I could read what he had to say. He himself was all but deceived by his own play acting. Each time he drew a line he examined it with great care, as if its meaning must suddenly leap to the eye, and every time a look of disappointment came over his face. But he would never give up trying, and there was an unspoken agreement between us that his scribblings had a meaning that I pretended to decipher. His own verbal commentary was so prompt in coming that I had no need to ask him to explain what he had written. pp. 288-89. What immediately follows this passage corresponds to a passage in the thesis which comes more than 40 pages, p. 89, after the above and concerns the function of the commandment, a significant fact to which I shall return. And now, no sooner was everyone assembled than he drew forth from a basket a piece of paper covered with scribbled lines and pretended to read from it. With a show of hesitation he looked up and down his list for the objects to be given in exchange for his people's presents. To so and so a bow and arrows, a machete. And another a string of beads. For his necklaces and so on for 2 solid hours. What was he hoping for? To deceive himself, perhaps, but, even more, to amaze his companions and persuade them that his intermediacy was responsible for the exchanges, that he had allied himself with the white man, and that he could now share in his secrets. We were in a hurry to get away, since there would obviously be a moment of real danger at which all the marvels I had brought would have been handed over. So I did not go further into the matter and we set off on the return journey, still guided by the Indians. po. 289. The story is very beautiful. It is in fact tempting to read it as a parable in which each element, each semen team, refers to a recognized function of writing, hierarchization, the economic function of mediation and of capitalization, participation in a quasi-religious secret. All this, verified in any phenomenon of writing, is here assembled, concentrated, organized in the structure of an exemplary event or a very brief sequence of fact and gestures. All the organic complexity of writing is here collected within the simple focus of a parable. Be the rememoration of the scene. Let us now pass on to the lesson of the lesson. It is longer than the relation of the incident, covers 3 very dense pages, and the text of the Conversations, which reproduces the essential parts of it, is considerably briefer. It is therefore in the thesis that the incident is reported without theoretical commentary and in the anthropologist's confession that the theory is most abundantly developed. Let us follow the thread of the demonstration through the evocation of apparently unquestionable historical facts. It is the split between the factual certainty and its interpretative reconsideration that will be of special interest to us. The most serious split appears first, but not only, between the meager fact of the extraordinary incident and the general philosophy of writing. The point of the incident in effect supports an enormous theoretical edifice. After the extraordinary incident, the anthropologist's situation remains precarious. Certain words dominate the description: abortive meeting, mystifications, something irritating. The anthropologist suddenly found himself alone, and lost, in the middle of the bush, in despair, demoralized. He was no longer armed in a hostile zone and he is agitated by dark thoughts. Then the threat subsides, the hostility disappears. It is night, the incident is closed, the exchanges have taken place, it is time to reflect upon the story, it is the moment of wakefulness and rememoration. Still tormented by this absurd incident, I slept badly. To while away the hours I went back, in my mind, to the scene of the previous morning. 2 significances are quickly drawn from the incident itself. 1. The appearance of writing is instantaneous. It is not prepared for. Such a leap would prove that the possibility of writing does not inhabit the violence of the letter speech, but the outside of speech. So writing had made its appearance among the Nambikura. But not at all, as one might have supposed, as the result of a laborious apprenticeship. From what does Levi Strauss arrive at this epigenetism that is indispensable if one wishes to safeguard the exteriority of writing to speech? From the incident. But the scene was not the scene of the origin, but only that of the imitation of writing. Even if it were a question of writing, what has the character of suddenness here is not the passage to writing, the invention of writing, but the importation of an already constituted writing. It is a borrowing and an artificial borrowing. As Levi Strauss himself says, the symbol had been borrowed, but the reality remained quite foreign to them. po. 290. Besides, this character of suddenness obviously belongs to all the phenomena of the diffusion or transmission of writing. It could never describe the appearance of writing, which has, on the contrary, been laborious, progressive, and differentiated in its stages. And the rapidity of the borrowing, when it happens, presupposes the previous presence of the structures that make it possible. 2. The second significance that Levi Strauss believes he can read in the very text of the scene is connected to the first. Since they learned without understanding, since the chief used writing effectively without knowing either the way it functioned or the content signified by it, the end of writing is political and not theoretical, sociological, rather than intellectual. po. 290. This opens and covers the entire space within which Levi Strauss is now going to think writing. The symbol had been borrowed, but the reality remained quite foreign to them. Even the borrowing had a sociological, rather than an intellectual object, for it was not a question of knowing specific things, or understanding them, or keeping them in mind, but merely of enhancing the prestige and authority of one individual or one function at the expense of the rest of the party. A native, still in the period of the Stone Age, had realized that even if he could not himself understand the great instrument of understanding, he could at least make it serve other ends. Po 290j. Distinguishing thus the sociological from the intellectual end, attributing the former and not the latter to writing, one credits a very problematic difference between intersubjective relationship and knowledge. If it is true, as I in fact believe, that writing cannot be thought outside of the horizon of intersubjective violence, is there anything, even science, that radically escapes it? Is there a knowledge, and, above all, a language, scientific or not, that one can call alien at once to writing and to violence? If one answers in the negative, as I do, the use of these concepts to discern the specific character of writing is not pertinent. So much so that all the examples 23 by which Levi Strauss next illustrates this proposition are of course true and probing, but too much so. The conclusion that they sustain goes far beyond the field of what is here called writing in the usual sense. It also covers the field of unwritten speech. In other words, if writing is to be related to violence, writing appears well before writing in the narrow sense, already in the difference or the archie-writing that opens speech itself. Thus suggesting what he will later confirm, that the essential function of writing is to favor the enslaving power rather than disinterested science. According to the distinction he seems to hold, Levi Strauss now can, in a second wave of meditation, neutralize the frontier between peoples without and with writing, not with regard to the use of writing, but with regard to what is supposed to be deducible from it, with regard to their historicity or non-historicity. This neutralization is very valuable. It authorizes the themes, a. of the essential and irreducible relativity in the perception of historical movement, d. res et histo-ire, b. of the differences between warm and cold in the historical temperature of societies, conversations, p. 43 pages 38 to 39 and passim, c. of the relationships between anthropology and history. 24 Thus, given this trust in the presumed difference between knowledge and power, it is a matter of showing that writing is not at all pertinent to the appreciation of historical rhythms and types. The age of the wholesale creation of social, economic, technical, political, and other structures, upon which we still subsist, the Neolithic age, did not know writing. Point 25 What does this imply? In the text that follows, I shall isolate three potentially controversial propositions. I shall not engage in the controversy, because I want to proceed more quickly to the end of the argument that interests Levi Strauss and to situate the debate there. First proposition. After eliminating all the criteria by which people habitually distinguish civilization from barbarism, this one should at least be retained, that certain peoples write and others do not. The first group can accumulate a body of knowledge, earlier acquisitions on science that helps it to move ever faster toward the goal that it has assigned to itself. The second is confined within limits that the memory of individuals can never hope to extend, and it must remain the prisoner of a history worked out from day to day, with neither an origin nor the lasting consciousness of a plan. Yet nothing of what we know of writing, or of its role in evolution, can be said to justify this conception. Po 29:1. This proposition has meaning only on two conditions. 1. That one take no notice of the idea and the project of science, of the idea, that is, of truth as a theoretically infinite transmissibility. This has an historical possibility only with writing. Faced with the Husserlian analyses, crisis and the origin of geometry, which remind us of this evidence, Levi Strauss's proposal can be sustained only by denying all the violence of the letterificity to the scientific project and to the value of truth in general. This last position does not lack force, but it cannot show the worth and coherence of that force except by relinquishing its claim to be a scientific discourse. A well-known pattern. It is in fact what seems to be happening here. 2. That the Neolithic, to which in fact may be attributed the creation of the deep structures upon which we still live, did not know anything like writing. It is here that the concept of writing, as it is used by a modern anthropologist, would seem singularly narrow. Anthropology today gives us a great deal of information about scripts that preceded the alphabet, about other systems of phonetic writing or systems quite ready to be phoneticized. The weight of this information makes it unnecessary for us to insist. Second proposition. Supposing everything was acquired before writing, Levi Strauss has only to argue, conversely, between the invention of writing and the birth of modern science, the Western world has lived through some 5,000 years, during which time the sum of its knowledge has rather gone up and down and known a steady increase. Po 292, italics added. One could be shocked by this affirmation, but I shall avoid that. I do not believe that such an affirmation is false. But no more do I believe that it is true. It is rather an answer, suiting a particular purpose, to a meaningless question. Point 26 Is not the notion of the quantity of knowledge suspect? What is a quantity of knowledge? How is it modified? Without speaking of the science of order or of quality, we may wonder what the quantity of the science of pure quantity signifies. How can it be evaluated in quantity? Such questions can only be answered in the style of pure empiricity. Unless one attempts to respect the very complex laws of the capitalization of learning, something that cannot be done without considering writing more attentively. One can say the opposite of what Levi Strauss says and it would be neither truer nor more false. One can say that during such and such a half-century, even before modern science, and today every minute, the accretion of knowledge has gone infinitely beyond what it was for millennia. So much for accretion. As for the notion of fluctuation, it presents itself as perfectly empirical. In any case, propositions of essence can never be made to fit a scale. Third proposition. It is the most disconcerting step in the development of this paragraph. Let us suppose that the advent of writing 3,000 or 4,000 years ago had brought nothing decisive in the domain of knowledge. Levi Strauss concedes nevertheless that it has not at all been the same thing for the last 2 centuries. However, according to his own scale, it is not clear what justifies this cut-off point. Yet it is there. Doubtless the scientific expansion of the 19th and 20th centuries could hardly have occurred, had writing not existed. But this condition, however necessary, cannot in itself explain that expansion. Not only is the cut-off point surprising, but one also wonders what particular objection Levi Strauss seems to reject here. No one has ever thought that writing the written notation, since that is at issue here, was the sufficient condition of science, and that it would suffice to know how to write in order to be learned. Much has been written that would suffice to rid us of this illusion if we possessed it. But recognize that writing is the necessary condition of science, that there is no science without writing, is what is important, and Levi Strauss knows this. And as it is difficult in any rigorous way to place the beginnings of science in the 19th century, his entire argument founders on or is contaminated by the gross mark of empirical approximation. In truth this depends, and that is why I pass over this argument quickly, on the fact that Levi Strauss is determined to abandon this terrain, to explain very quickly why the problem of science is not the best access to the origin and function of writing. If we want to correlate the appearance of writing with certain other characteristics of civilization, we must look elsewhere. Po 292. Thus it must rather be demonstrated that, according to the dissociation which had perplexed us, the origin of writing responded to a more sociological than intellectual necessity. The following page must therefore not only make clear the sociological necessity, which would be a poor truism and would have little enough to do with the sociological specificity of writing, but also that this social necessity is that of domination, exploitation, enslavement, and perfidy. To read this page appropriately, one must differentiate it into its strata. The author presents here what he calls his hypothesis. Why hypothesis is correct. The primary function of writing, as a means of communication, is to facilitate 27 the enslavement of other human beings. On a first level, this hypothesis is so quickly confirmed that it hardly merits its name. These facts are well known. It has long been known that the power of writing in the hands of a small number, caste, or class, is always contemporaneous with hierarchization, let us say with political difference. It is at the same time distinction into groups, classes, and levels of economico-politico-technical power, and delegation of authority, power deferred and abandoned to an organ of capitalization. This phenomenon is produced from the very onset of sedentarization, with the constitution of stocks at the origin of agricultural societies. Here things are so patent 28 that the empirical illustration that Levi Strauss sketches could be infinitely enriched. This entire structure appears as soon as a society begins to live as a society, that is to say from the origin of life in general, when, at very heterogeneous levels of organization and complexity, it is possible to defer presence, that is to say expense or consumption, and to organize production, that is to say the violence of the letter reserve in general. This is produced well before the appearance of writing in the narrow sense, but it is true, and one cannot ignore it, that the appearance of certain systems of writing 3,000 or 4,000 years ago was an extraordinary leap in the history of life. All the more extraordinary because a prodigious expansion of the power of difference was not accompanied, at least during these millennia, by any notable transformation of the organism. It is precisely the property of the power of difference to modify life less and less as it spreads out more and more. It should grow infinite and its essence excludes this a priori life itself would be made into an impassive, intangible, and eternal presence, infinite difference, God, or death. This leads us to a second level of reading. It will show, at the same time, Levi Strauss's final intention, toward which the demonstration orients the factual evidence, as well as the political ideology that, in the name of a Marxist hypothesis, is articulated with the finest example of what I have called the metaphysics of presence. Previously the empirical character of the analyses concerning the status of science and the accumulation of knowledge removed all rigor from each of the propositions advanced and permitted their consideration with an equal pertinence as true or false. It is the pertinence of the question which appeared doubtful. The same thing happens here again. What is going to be called enslavement can equally legitimately be called liberation. And the moment that this oscillation is stopped and the signification of enslavement that the discourse is frozen into a determined ideology that we would judge disturbing if such were our first preoccupation here. In this text, Levi Strauss does not distinguish between hierarchization and domination, between political authority and exploitation. The tone that pervades these reflections is of an anarchism that deliberately confounds law and oppression. The idea of law and positive right, although it is difficult to think them in their formula where it is so general that ignorance of the law is no defense before the possibility of writing, is determined by Levi Strauss as constraint and enslavement. Political power can only be the custodian of an unjust power. A classical and coherent thesis, but here advanced as self-evident, without opening the least bit of critical dialogue with the holders of the other thesis, according to which the generality of the law is on the contrary the condition of liberty in the city. No dialogue, for example, with Rousseau who would no doubt have shuddered to see a self-proclaimed disciple define law as follows: writing may not have sufficed to consolidate human knowledge, but it may have been indispensable to the consolidation of dominions. To bring the matter nearer to our own time, the European-wide movement towards compulsory education in the 19th century went hand in hand with the extension of military service and with proletarialization. The struggle against illiteracy is thus indistinguishable from the increased powers exerted over the individual citizen by the central authority. For it is only when everyone can read that authority can decree that ignorance of law is no defense. 29 One must be careful in order to appreciate these grave declarations. One must above all avoid reversing them and taking the opposite view. In a certain given historical structure, for example, in the age of which Levi Strauss speaks, it is undoubtedly true that the progress of formal legality, the struggle against illiteracy, and the like, could have functioned as a mystifying force and an instrument consolidating the power of a class or a state whose formal universal significance was confiscated by a particular empirical force. Perhaps this necessity is indispensable and impossible to supersede. To derive from it the authority to define the law and the state in a simple and univocal manner, to condemn them from an ethical point of view, and with them the extension of writing, compulsory military service and proletarialization, the generality of political obligation and the idea that ignorance of the law is no defense, is a consequence that cannot be rigorously deduced from these premises. If they are nevertheless deduced, as here, it must also be concluded that non-exploitation, liberty and the like go hand in hand, to utilize this most equivocal concept, with illiteracy and the absence of compulsory military service, public instruction, or law in general. I shall not belabor the obvious. Let us beware of opposing Levi Strauss to the system of classical arguments, or of opposing him to himself. On the preceding page, he had linked the violence of writing to the fact that it was reserved for a minority, confiscated by the scribes in the service of a caste. Now, an enslaving violence is assigned to total literacy. The incoherence is only apparent. Universality is always monopolized as empirical force by a determined empirical force, such is the unique affirmation that is common to both these propositions. In order to tackle this problem, should one wonder what the meaning of enslavement to a law of universal form can be? One could do it, but it is better to give up that classical course. It would soon enough show us that the access to writing is the constitution of a free subject in the violent movement of its own effacement and of its own bondage. A movement unthinkable within the classical concepts of ethics, psychology, political philosophy, and metaphysics. Let us leave that proposition up in the air, for we have not yet finished reading the writing lesson. For Levi Strauss goes further under the auspices of this libertarian ideology, whose anti-colonialist and anti-ethnocentric hue is rather specific. All this moved rapidly from the national to the international level, thanks to the mutual complicity which sprang up between newborn states confronted as these were with the problems that had been our own, a century or two ago, the violence of the letter, and an international society of peoples long privileged. These latter recognize that their stability may well be endangered by nations whose knowledge of the written word has not, as yet, empowered them to think in formulae which can be modified at will. Such nations are not yet ready to be edified, and when they are first given the freedom of the library shelves au savoir in tas dans les bibliothèques, they are perilously vulnerable to the ever more deliberate why misleading, mendacious mensonges effects of the printed word, italics added. Taking the same precautions that we took a moment ago with respect to the possible truthfulness of such statements, let us paraphrase this text. It is, in the name of the liberty of formerly colonized peoples, a critique of the young states that side with the old states so recently denounced, complicity between young states and an international society of peoples long privileged. Critique of an enterprise, the propagation of writing is presented through the concepts of a voluntarist psychology, the international political phenomenon that it constitutes is described in terms of a deliberately and consciously organized plot. A critique of the state in general and of the young states that extend writing for propagandistic ends, to assure the legibility and effectiveness of their tracts, to protect themselves from nations whose knowledge of the written word has not, as yet, empowered them to think in formulae which can be modified at will. Which implies that oral formulae are not modifiable, not more modifiable at will than written formulae. This is not the least of the paradoxes. Yet once again, I do not profess that writing may not and does not in fact play this role, but from that to attribute to writing the specificity of this role and to conclude that speech is exempt from it, is an abyss that one must not leap over so lightly. I shall not comment on what is said about access to knowledge piled up on library shelves, determined in an unequivocal way as vulnerability to the mendacious effects of the printed word and so on. The ideological atmosphere within which such formulae breathe today could be described. Suffice it to recognize here the heritage of the second discourse, throwing aside, therefore, all those scientific books and contemplating the first and most simple operations of the human soul. Po 157:0 Man, behold your history, such as I have thought to read it, not in books written by your fellow creatures, who are liars, but in nature, which never lies. Po 176, of Emile, the misuse of books is the death of learning. As so many books lead us to neglect the book of the world. We should not read, but rather look. I get rid of the chief cause of their sorrows, namely their books. Reading is the curse of childhood. The child who reads ceases to think, etc., of a Savoyard priest, so I closed all my books. pp. 57 plus 575, 186, 378, pages 414, 415, 131, 270 of the Lettre à Christophe de Beaumont. I looked for truth in books, I found them nothing but lies and error. Asterisk after this nocturnal meditation, Levi Strauss returns to the extraordinary incident. And it is to give praise, now justified by history, to those wise Nambiquae who had the courage to resist writing as well as the mystification of their leader. Praise to those who knew to interrupt only for a time, alas the fatal course of evolution, and who won themselves a respite. In this respect and with regard to what concerns Nambiquae society, the anthropologist is resolutely conservative. As he will note about 100 pages later, at home, the anthropologist may be a natural subversive, a convinced opponent of traditional usage, but no sooner has he in focus a society different from his own than he becomes respectful of even the most conservative practices. Po 380. Two motifs in the concluding lines, on the one hand, as with Rousseau, the theme of a necessary or rather fatal degradation, as the very form of progress, on the other hand, nostalgia for what preceded this degradation, an effective impulse toward the islets of resistance, the small communities that have provisionally protected themselves from corruption, cf. Conversations, p. 49 po 41 on this subject, a corruption linked, as in Rousseau, to writing and to the dislocation of a unanimous people assembled in the self-presence of its speech. We shall return to this. Let us read, doubtless the die is already cast, the question here is the fatal evolution into which peoples who were hitherto protected from writing are already seduced, a more fatalistic than determinable proposition. The historical concatenation is thought under the concept of play and chance. The frequency metaphor of the player in Levi Strauss's texts must be studied. But in my Nambiquae village people, in the original Fortes Tets, strong-minded people were not so easily taken in, italics added. These strong-minded people are the resistors, those whom their leader could not trick, and who have more character than subtlety, more heart and traditional pride than openness of mind. Those who moved away from him, after he had tried to play the civilized man, after my visit Hev.ras abandoned by most of his followers, must have had a confused understanding of the fact that writing, on this its first appearance in their midst, had allied itself with falsehood, and so they had taken refuge, deeper in the bush, to win themselves a respite. P. 029:3. The episode of this resistance is also given in the thesis, p. 89. If words have a meaning, and if writing, on this its first appearance in their midst, had allied itself with falsehood, one should think that deception and all the associated values and non-values were absent in society's asterisk over completes. Paris, 1835, p. 77:5. The violence of the letter without writing. To doubt this it is not necessary to cover a lot of ground, only an empirical detour by the evocation of facts, the a priori or transcendental regression that we followed by way of introduction. Recalling in this introduction that violence did not wait for the appearance of writing in the narrow sense, that writing has always begun in language, we, like Levi Strauss, conclude that violence is writing. But, coming at it another way, this proposition has a radically different meaning. It ceases to be supported by the myth, by the myth of a speech originally good, and of a violence which would come to pounce upon it as a fatal accident. A fatal accident which is nothing but history itself. Not that, by this more or less overt reference to the idea of a fall into evil from the innocence of the word, Levi Strauss makes this classical and implicit theology his own. It is just that his anthropological discourse is produced through concepts, schemata, and values that are, systematically and genealogically, accomplices of this theology and this metaphysics. Therefore I shall not make the long empirical or a priori digression here. I shall merely compare different moments in the description of Nambiquae society. If the lesson is to be believed, the Nambiquae did not know violence before writing, nor hierarchization, since that is quickly assimilated into exploitation. Round about the lesson, it suffices to open Trees Tropiques and the thesis at any page to find striking evidence to the contrary. We are dealing here not only with a strongly hierarchized society, but with a society where relationships are marked with a spectacular violence. As spectacular as the innocent and tender frolics evoked at the beginning of the lesson, and that we were thus justified in considering as the calculated premises of a loaded argumentee. Among many analogous passages that we cannot cite here, let us look at page 87 of the dissertation. The subject is clearly the Nambiquae before writing, and the leader must display an unfailing talent, related more to electoral politics than to the exercise of power, to maintain his group, and, if possible, enlarge it through new memberships. The nomadic band represents in fact a fragile unity. If the leader's authority is too exacting, if he monopolizes too great a number of women, if he is not capable during periods of dearth of resolving problems of food, discontent arises, individuals or families break away and conglomerate into a kindred group whose affairs seem better conducted, better nourished due to the discovery of hunting or fruit and berry picking grounds, or richer through exchange with neighboring groups, or more powerful after victorious battles. The leader then finds himself at the head of too limited a group, incapable of facing daily difficulties, or whose women are open to rape by stronger neighbors. He is then obliged to abdicate, and with his last faithful friends, to throw in his lot with the more fortunate faction. Nambiquae society is thus in a perpetual state of flux, groups form and unform, enlarge and disappear and, sometimes at intervals of a few months, the composition, number, and regrouping of the bands become unrecognizable. All these transformations are accompanied by intrigues and conflicts, rises and falls, all being produced at an extremely fast pace. One could also cite entire chapters of the thesis entitled War and Commerce, and From Birth to Death. Also everything concerning the use of poisons, in the thesis and in Trees Tropiques, just as there is a battle of proper names, there is a battle of poisons in which the anthropologist is himself embroiled. A delegation of 4 men came to me and, in a quite threatening tone, asked me to mix poison, which they brought me at the same time, with the next dish that I should offer to A6. It was considered indispensable to suppress him rapidly, because, I was told, he was very wicked, cakery, and totally worthless. A. Dawson, p. 124. I shall cite only one more passage, happy complement of an idyllic description. I have described the tender comradeship which presides over the relationship between the sexes, and the general harmony which reigns in the bosom of the groups. But as soon as these change for the worse, it is to make room for the most extreme solutions, poisonings and assassinations. No South American group, to our knowledge, conveys in so sincere and spontaneous a manner violent and opposed sentiments, whose individual expression seems indissociable from a social stylization that never betrays them. P. 126. Is this final formula not applicable to all social groups in general? 2. Thus we are led back to Rousseau. The ideal profoundly underlying this philosophy of writing is therefore the image of a community immediately present to itself, without difference, a community of speech where all the members are within earshot. To confirm this, I shall refer neither to Tristes Tropiques nor to its theoretical echo, the Conversations, but to a text included in Structural Anthropology and completed in 1958 with allusions to Tristes Tropiques. Writing is here defined as the condition of social inauthenticity. In this respect it is, rather, modem societies that should be defined by a privative character. Our relations with one another are now only occasionally and fragmentarily based upon global experience, the concrete apprehension of one person by another. They are largely the result of a indirect construction, through written documents. We are no longer linked to our past by an oral tradition which implies direct vico contact with others, storytellers, priests, wise men, or elders, but by books amassed in libraries, books from which criticism endeavors with extreme difficulty to form a picture of their authors. And we communicate with the immense majority of our contemporaries by all kinds of intermediaries, written documents or administrative machinery which on the violence of the letter doubtedly vastly extend our contacts but at the same time make those contacts somewhat unauthentic. This has become typical of the relationship between the citizen and the public authorities. We should like to avoid describing negatively the tremendous revolution brought about by the invention of writing. But it is essential to realize that writing, while it conferred vast benefits on humanity, did in fact deprive it of something fundamental. pp 400-02, italics added, pages 36-3 to 64. From then on, the anthropologist's mission carries an ethical significance, to find and fix on that terrain the levels of authenticity. The criterion of authenticity is the neighborliness in the small communities where everyone knows everyone else. On the contrary, if we carefully consider the points on which anthropological investigations have been brought to bear, we note that in its increasingly intensive study of modern societies, anthropology has endeavored to identify levels of authenticity within them. When the ethnologist studies a village, an enterprise, or the neighborhood of a large town, his task is facilitated by the fact that almost everyone knows everyone else. In the future, it will no doubt be recognized that anthropology's most important contribution to social sciences is to have introduced, if unknowingly, this fundamental distinction between two types of social existence, a way of life recognized at the outset as traditional and archaic and characteristic of authentic societies, and a more modern form of existence, from which the first named type is not absent but where groups that are not completely, or are imperfectly, authentic, are organized within a much larger and specifically unauthentic system. pp 402-03, pp 364-65. The clarity of this text is sufficient unto itself. In the future, it may be recognized if this is in fact anthropology's most important contribution to social science. This model of a small community with a crystalline structure, completely self-present, assembled in its own neighborhood, is undoubtedly Rousseauistic. We shall have to examine this very closely in more than one text. For the moment, and always for the same reasons, let us rather turn to the essay. Rousseau shows there that social distance, the dispersion of the neighborhood, is the condition of oppression, arbitrariness, and vice. The governments of oppression all make the same gesture, to break presence, the co-presence of citizens, the unanimity of assembled peoples, to create a situation of dispersion, holding subjects so far apart as to be incapable of feeling themselves together in the space of one and the same speech, one and the same persuasive exchange. This phenomenon is described in the last chapter of the essay. The now recognized ambiguity of this structure is such that one can equally well reverse its direction and show that this co-presence is sometimes also that of the crowd subjected to a demagogic harangue. We must attend to the signs of Rousseau's vigilance when confronted by the possibility of such a reversal. Nevertheless, the essay first puts us on guard against the structures of S0 chain life and of information within the modern political machine. It is a praise of eloquence, or rather of the elocution of the full speech, a condemnation of mute and impersonal signs, money, tracts, placards, weapons and soldiers in uniform. The languages develop naturally on the basis of men's needs, changing and varying as those needs change. In ancient times, when persuasion played the role of public force, eloquence was necessary. Of what use would it be today, when public force has replaced persuasion? One needs neither art nor metaphor to say such is my pleasure. What sort of public discourses remain then? Sermons. And why should those who preach them be concerned to persuade the people, since it is not they who dispose of benefices? Our popular tongues have become just as completely useless as eloquence. Societies have assumed their final form, no longer is anything changed except by arms and cash. And since there is nothing to say to people besides give money, it is said with placards on street corners or by soldiers in their homes. It is not necessary to assemble anyone for that. On the contrary, the subjects must be kept apart. LL1 is the first maxim of modern politics. It was easy for the ancients to make themselves understood by people in public. They could speak all day with no discomfort. If a man were to harangue the people of Paris in the Place Vendôme in French, if he shouted at the top of his voice, people would hear him shouting, but they would not be able to distinguish a word. If charlatans are less common in the public squares of France than in those of Italy, it is not because they would be less well heard écoutes in France, but only because they would not be as well understood entendus. But I say that any tongue with which one cannot make oneself understood to the people assembled is a slavish tongue. It is impossible for a people to remain free and speak the tongue. Chap 10, Relationship of Languages to Government, pages 72-73. Self-presence, transparent proximity in the face-to-face of countenances and the immediate range of the voice. This determination of social authenticity is therefore classic, Rousseauistic, but already the inheritor of Platonism. It relates, we recall, to the anarchistic and libertarian protestations against law, the powers, and the state in general, and also with the dream of the 19th century utopian socialisms, most specifically with the dream of Fourierism. In his laboratory, or rather in his studio, the anthropologist too uses this dream, as one weapon or instrument among others. Serving the same obstinate desire within which the anthropologist always puts something of himself, this tool must come to terms with other means to hand. For the anthropologist also desires to be Freudian, Marxist, with a L\1 Arxism, as we recall, whose work of criticism would be neither in opposition nor in contradiction with Buddhist criticism, and he even confesses to being tempted by vulgar materialism. 30 The only weakness of bricolage, but, seen as a weakness is it not irremediable, is a total inability to justify itself in its own discourse. The violence of the letter already there-ness of instruments and of concepts cannot be undone or reinvented. In that sense, the passage from desire to discourse always loses itself in bricolage. It builds its castles with debris, mythical thought. Builds ideological castles out of the debris of what was once a social discourse. The Savage Mind, p. 32 po. 21. In the best of cases, the discourse of bricolage can confess in itself its desire and its defeat, provoke the thought of the essence and the necessity of the already there, recognize that the most radical discourse, the most inventive and systematic engineer are surprised and circumvented by a history, a language, etc., a world, for world means nothing else, from which they must borrow their tools, if only to destroy the former machine, the straw catapult. Bricolage seems originally to have been a machine of war or the hunt, constructed to destroy. And who can believe the image of the peaceful bricoler? The idea of the engineer breaking with all bricolage is dependent on a creationist theology. Only such a theology can sanction an essential and rigorous difference between the engineer and the bricoler. But that the engineer should always be a sort of bricoler should not ruin all criticism of bricolage, quite the contrary. Criticism in what sense? First of all, if the difference between bricoler and engineer is basically theological, the very concept of bricolage implies a fall and an accidental finitude. This techno-theological significance must be abandoned in order to think the originary appurtenance of desire to discourse, of discourse to the history of the world, and the already threeness of the language in which desire deludes itself. Then, even supposing that, by bricolage, one conserves the idea of bricolage, one must know that all bricolages are not equally worthwhile. Bricolage criticizes itself. Finally, the value of social authenticity is one of the two indispensable poles of the structure of morality in general. The ethic of the living word would be perfectly respectable, completely utopian, and atopic utopic eta to pj as it is, unconnected to spacing and to difference as writing. It would be as respectable as respect itself if it did not live on a delusion and a non-respect for its own condition of origin, if it did not dream in speech of a presence denied to writing, denied by writing. The ethic of speech is the delusion of presence mastered. Like the bricole, the delusion, or lure designates first a hunter's stratagem. It is a term of falconry, a piece of red feather, says Littra, in the form of a bird, which serves to recall the bird of prey when it does not return straight to the fist. Example, the master called, made a feint, held fist and lured toward what seemed turned to stone. La Fontaine, Fables, 12, 1-2, The Fables of La Fontaine, T.R. Marianne Moore, New York, 1952, p. 294. To recognize writing in speech, that is to say difference and the absence of speech, is to begin to think the lure. There is no ethics without the presence of the other but also, and consequently, without absence, dissimulation, detour, difference, writing. The archy writing is the origin of morality as of immorality. The non-ethical opening of ethics. A violent opening. As in the case of the vulgar concept of writing, the ethical instance of violence must be rigorously suspended in order to repeat the genealogy of morals. Since they both scorn writing, Rousseau and Levi-Strauss both praise the range of the voice. Nevertheless, in the text Chat we must now read, Rousseau is suspicious also of the illusion of full and present speech, of the illusion of presence within a speech believed to be transparent and innocent. It is toward the praise of silence that the myth of a full presence wrenched from difference and from the violence of the word is then deviated. Nevertheless, in a certain way, public force has already begun to compensate for supplier persuasion. It is perhaps time to reread the essay on the origin of languages.